Let's get started on some of these words. Hello everyone and welcome back to Lorenzo's DMs. Today we're going to be talking about gender identity. What gender are you? One of the most common questions that I get in my DMs is, hey Lorenzo, I'm really struggling with my gender identity. I'm super confused. Can you please help me? So today we're going to be briefly discussing some of the most common gender identities, but there are a ton of new micro labels popping up all over the place these days. So if one of the gender identities today doesn't seem to be a good fit for you, definitely do your own research and look into all of these other labels that are out there. Today we're mostly going to be going over some of the most basic definitions so that you all can have an understanding of where to start. One of the very first things that I actually suggest to a lot of folks is to first check out the gender graph, which I will put here for all of you to see. The gender graph is a really helpful tool when we think about just charting gender identity in general. It's not just, a linear line, so to say. It's not just a spectrum. It can be very fluid. It can change over time. Additionally, I just want to share that we're going to be going over information that is current and up to date in our community right now, but things change. And what is today will be history tomorrow. So please keep that in mind. And if this tends to be outdated in some way when you're watching this, definitely do your own research and see what the most updated information is at the time. So the first most basic term that all of us need to know is cisgender. And cisgender, I would say, is probably the majority of people, but I don't know anymore if that is even true. Cisgender means that your biological sex assigned at birth correlates with your gender identity. For example, if you were assigned the biological sex of male when you were born, you identify, your gender identity would be boy or a man. Similarly, if you were born female, you would say that you identify as a girl or as a woman. We also need to not forget our intersex friends. It is not just male or female in terms of biological sex. There is a range of anatomy and physical components and DNA and things that are involved. Intersex folks do exist and we do need to give them visibility and acknowledgement in this process as well. So if you are born intersex, you may choose to identify as a boy, you may choose to identify as a girl, you may choose to identify as non-binary or somewhere on our trans spectrum. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Agender. Not a gender, but agender. I don't know why I do this. Agender is somebody who does not identify with any gender. You might say they are without gender. Genderqueer, in my opinion, feels like an outdated term. I used to identify as genderqueer. I guess technically I do, but I just don't use that word anymore. A genderqueer person does not subscribe to conventional or traditional gender identities. It might be that they identify as neither, as both, or as a combination. Next we have non-binary, which is me. A non-binary person is somebody who identifies in between genders, or a little bit of both, perhaps. Genderfluid is somebody that is also in the non-binary space, you could say, but the gender identity tends to be more in flux. It can vary. A genderfluid person might feel really female one day and might feel more masculine another, so there's more of that fluidity there. To return to the question of flux, in my understanding, this means that you might fluctuate quickly or back and forth between one gender or another, multiple genders. Again, I'm not an expert on this particular term. I don't identify as such, so if you are someone who identifies as gender fluid or gender flux and you have more commentary on this topic, please comment something in the section below. I would really appreciate that, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers of this video would as well. Next we have androgynous, which I also identify as androgynous personally. I think this term is a little particular. Androgynous tends to be a term that focuses more on those surface indicators, on appearances, for example. I look fairly androgynous, meaning that when someone looks at me, it's kind of hard to tell whether I'm a boy or a girl. That's the general understanding from what I've felt in my experience is androgynous. If we want to really unpack this term, it might be considered less of an identity and more of an adjective to describe appearance, but I consider it to be identity for me. And it could be used in that way. So just to kind of think about that word more broadly is important. Next we have demi-boy and demi-girl, which have been two up-and-coming words that a lot of people that I know and folks in my following bases are using these days. So first of all, demi in general means part or in part. It is a prefix. So when we say demi-boy or demi-girl, it's typically meaning you partially identify as a boy most of the time, if you're a demi-boy, or you partially identify as a girl most of the time if you're a demi-girl. It doesn't matter what your biological sex is at birth. You can identify as those terms regardless of biological sex. Lastly, the term transgender, which is probably the most important term and is also the most umbrella term, I guess, when we think about all of this. So my most broad definition of transgender would be anything that is not cisgender, and that was the first word that we went over, right? So thinking about this cisgender identity, somebody whose biological sex at birth is male or female or intersex, you know, whatever that might be, and your gender identity aligns with that. So a transgender person would be anything that's not cisgender. So that could be non-binary, it could be genderfluid, it could be demi-boy, it could be demi-girl, it could be androgynous, it could be genderqueer, agender, all of these other words. A more specific definition of the term transgender would be somebody who transitions, right? So someone who is born biologically female and identifies as trans and is very strongly identifying as male. They would be considered FTM, or female to male, and they would perhaps want to transition physically and in other ways to look more and become more their true selves. Same thing with MTF, which would be male to female, someone who identifies as transgender and is born a biological sex of male and then transitions to identify and become their female self. So I think it's really important to think about these two different understandings of transgender, or perhaps how they kind of work together, right? We have the more broad term of transgender, which is this umbrella term of anything that's not cisgendered, and then we have the more specific term of trans when you are perhaps FTM or MTF. These are the most common gender identities that are out there right now in this moment. Things might change, but that's where we are right now. If you're an ally watching this, thank you so much for being a part and taking a stand and being an ally for us. We really appreciate your presence here. And for those of you who are trying to figure out your gender, I hope this is helpful. Again, if some of these words don't really fit with who you think you are, definitely check out the gender graph. I'm gonna link it again up here, and definitely just go do your own research on all the labels that exist out there. Please remember that this is something that evolves and changes over time. It's important to experiment and continue to self-reflect, because maybe a word that you identify with at first isn't that total evolution of who you are. Maybe you need to take a few steps further and figure out what that real identity is for you, and you will get there. Comment in the section below if you'd like to share your own experience, your own thoughts, and definitely please like the video. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will catch you in the next video. Cheers, everybody.